The fabric tore with a sound like thunder in the packed auditorium. Elena Rodriguez felt the cool air hit her back as her navy dress split from shoulder to waist, exposing her white blouse underneath. 500 parents, students, and faculty members watched in stunned silence as she stood frozen on the gymnasium stage, the microphone still clutched in her trembling hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, 3 boys snickered into their sleeves. Caleb Morrison, the ringleader with his perfectly styled hair and varsity jacket, whispered something to his friends that made them laugh harder. They had planned this moment for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity when she would be most vulnerable, most exposed, most humiliated. What they didn't know was that Elena Rodriguez had faced much worse than teenage cruelty. What they couldn't see beneath her torn dress were the scars that mapped a different kind of battlefield, a place where survival meant more than just enduring embarrassment. What they had no way of knowing was that their prank had just awakened something that had been sleeping for 3 years, something that understood the difference between retreat and tactical repositioning. Elena slowly turned around to face the auditorium. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, as it carried through the microphone to every corner of the silent gymnasium. "Sometimes," she said, looking directly at Caleb, "people mistake kindness for weakness. That's always been their first mistake." She set the microphone down carefully, stepped off the stage, and walked toward the exit with her shoulders straight and her head high, leaving behind a silence so complete that even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. When Elena Rodriguez first walked through the doors of Oakwood Middle School that August morning, she carried herself like someone who had learned to make herself small. Her movements were precise but unassuming, her voice soft but clear, her presence somehow both forgettable and oddly compelling. The other teachers noticed her immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she seemed to deflect it so deliberately. She wore simple clothes in muted colors, gray cardigans, navy slacks, sensible flats that made no sound on the polished hallways. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore minimal makeup. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had once worn combat boots and carried a rifle through the mountains of Afghanistan, that she had crawled through mud under live fire, or that she had earned the respect of soldiers twice her size. Through sheer determination and unbreakable composure, the principal, Dr. Margaret Holloway, had introduced her to the staff during orientation as their new 8th grade English teacher. Elena had nodded politely, answered questions about her education with brief, accurate responses, and volunteered for lunch duty without being asked. She seemed eager to blend in, to be helpful without being noticed, to contribute without causing waves. Room 142 became her domain, a corner classroom on the 2nd floor that overlooked the student parking lot and the football field beyond. She arranged the desks in a semicircle, hung maps of different countries on the walls, and placed a small American flag in the corner near her desk. When asked about it by another teacher, she simply said it reminded her of home, the first few weeks passed without incident. Elena taught her classes with quiet authority, assigning essays on topics like courage, integrity, and overcoming adversity. Her students found her assignments challenging but fair, her grading tough but consistent. She never raised her voice, never lost her temper, and never seemed rattled by the typical middle school chaos that surrounded her. But Caleb Morrison had been watching her from the beginning, and he sensed something different about the new teacher. She didn't react to disruptions the way the others did. When students talked during her lessons, she would simply stop speaking and wait, her gray eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. When papers were turned in late, she would accept them without argument, but dock points without explanation. When challenged or questioned, she would respond with facts rather than emotion, leaving her critics with nothing to push against. Caleb was used to getting reactions. At 14, He had already perfected the art of finding teachers' weak spots and exploiting them. Mrs. Peterson cried when students were disrespectful. Mr. Jenkins turned red when questioned about grades. Coach Williams could be goaded into shouting matches that got students sent to the office, where the principal would inevitably side with the misunderstood star athlete. But Elena Rodriguez was different. She seemed impervious to the usual tactics, responding to provocation with the kind of calm that suggested either supreme confidence or complete indifference. Either way, it frustrated Caleb in a way he couldn't quite articulate. His first attempt to rattle her came during the third week of school. He had accidentally knocked over her coffee mug while walking past her desk, sending dark liquid spreading across her lesson plans and gradebook. Elena had looked at the spreading stain for a moment, then calmly opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small towel. She cleaned up the mess without comment, threw the towel in the trash, and continued with her lesson as if nothing had happened. The incident might have ended there, but Caleb's friends, Jake Patterson and Dylan Cruz, had witnessed his failure to provoke a response. In the social hierarchy of 8th grade, being ignored by a teacher was almost worse than being punished. It suggested that you weren't even worth acknowledging, that your rebellion was so insignificant it didn't merit a reaction. So Caleb escalated. He began arriving late to class, making sure to disrupt the lesson as he found his seat. He would tap his pencil constantly during quiet work time, just loud enough to be annoying but not quite loud enough to justify intervention. He would ask obviously sarcastic questions during discussions, hiding his mockery behind a veneer of fake curiosity. Elena documented everything. She kept a small notebook where she recorded arrival times, disruptive behaviors, and inappropriate comments. She never confronted Caleb directly, never sent him to the office, never gave him the satisfaction of knowing he was getting under her skin. Instead, she simply watched and waited, gathering information with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge was its own form of power. What Elena couldn't document was the growing sense of unease that followed her through the hallways. She had developed instincts in Afghanistan that didn't simply disappear when she returned to civilian life. She could feel when she was being watched, could sense hostility even when it was hidden behind smiles and polite words. And lately, those instincts had been working overtime. Caleb and his friends had begun timing their movements to hers. They would appear in hallways when she was walking to the copy machine, hover near her classroom door during her planning period, and find excuses to walk past her during lunch duty. It wasn't overtly threatening, but it was deliberate, calculated, designed to make her feel observed and vulnerable. Other teachers might have dismissed it as coincidence or typical teenage behavior. But Elena had learned to trust her gut in situations where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. And her gut was telling her that Caleb Morrison was planning something that went beyond ordinary classroom mischief. She began varying her routines, taking different routes through the building, arriving and leaving unpredictable times. She made note of which teachers were nearby during different periods, which hallways had security cameras, and which areas of the school were most isolated. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The preparation paid off when she overheard a conversation between Caleb and Dylan near the vending machines one afternoon. She had been returning from the library when she heard her name mentioned, followed by laughter and the phrase "school assembly." She couldn't make out the details, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was being planned, and she was the target. That evening, Elena sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and her lesson plan spread before her. But instead of grading papers, she found herself thinking about the upcoming fall assembly, scheduled for the following Friday. All students and faculty would be required to attend, along with parents and community members. It would be crowded, chaotic, and difficult to control, the perfect environment for a public humiliation. She closed her eyes and tried to push away the memories that threatened to surface. The sound of laughter in the school hallway was nothing like the sound of gunfire in the mountains, but her body didn't always recognize the difference. Both represented danger, both required vigilance, and both could be survived with the right preparation and mindset. Elena opened her laptop and began researching the layout of the school gymnasium, studying the floor plan and noting the locations of exits, the position of the stage, and the arrangement of seating. She made mental notes about sightlines and potential hazards, treating the upcoming assembly like a mission briefing rather than a school event. She didn't sleep well that night, but she wasn't afraid. Fear was a luxury she had learned to set aside years ago in favor of more practical emotions like caution and determination. Whatever Caleb Morrison was planning, she would be ready for it. She had faced down enemies with actual weapons in actual war zones. She could certainly handle a 14-year-old boy with a grudge and too much time on his hands, but as she finally drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling through her mind. Caleb Morrison had no idea what he was about to unleash. And neither did anyone else at Oakwood Middle School. The photograph was tucked between the pages of Elena's gradebook, forgotten until it slipped out while she was reviewing test scores. The image showed a younger version of herself in desert camouflage, standing with her unit outside of Forward Operating Base. Her face was leaner then, hardened by months of desert sun and constant vigilance. She held her rifle with casual competence, and her eyes held a sharpness that had nothing to do with the camera flash. Elena picked up the photo and studied it for a moment before sliding it back into the gradebook. She had been Sergeant Rodriguez, then responsible for communications equipment that kept her unit connected to the outside world when they were deep in hostile territory. The radio on her back had been more than just equipment. It had been a lifeline for soldiers who depended on her to call in medical evacuations, supply drops, and tactical support. She remembered the weight of that responsibility, the way it had shaped her into someone who never acted without thinking, never spoke without purpose, and never backed down when lives were on the line. Those skills had served her well in Afghanistan, and they were serving her now in ways her students couldn't possibly understand. The morning of the assembly dawned gray and humid, the kind of weather that made the school's ancient ventilation system work overtime. Elena arrived early, as always, but instead of going directly to her classroom, she took a detour through the gymnasium. The custodial staff was already setting up chairs in neat rows, and the maintenance crew was testing the sound system on the stage. She walked the perimeter of the room, noting the emergency exits and the placement of faculty seating. The stage was elevated about 3 feet above the gymnasium floor, with stairs on either side. A long table had been placed across the back of the stage for the teachers who would be speaking, including Elena, who was scheduled to present the school's new anti-bullying initiative. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had volunteered for the presentation partly because she believed in the message, but mostly because she knew Caleb would find it impossible to resist the symbolism. What better way to humiliate the teacher who preached about bullying prevention than to make her the victim of bullying in front of the entire school community? Elena examined the microphone system, testing the cord length and noting how far she could move before being tethered by the wire. She studied the lighting, the angles of approach, and the sight lines from various parts of the gymnasium. To anyone watching, she might have appeared to be simply familiarizing herself with the space. In reality, she was conducting reconnaissance. At lunch, she overheard Caleb and his friends discussing their plans in the hallway outside the cafeteria. They weren't being particularly subtle, confident that no adult would take their chatter seriously. Elena caught fragments of conversation, something about fishing line, perfect timing, and everyone will see it. She filed the information away and continued walking, her expression unchanged. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. Amanda Foster, a quiet girl from Elena's third period class, approached her desk after the final bell. Amanda rarely spoke unless called upon, preferring to observe from the back row where she thought nobody noticed her. But Elena had noticed everything about Amanda: the way she flinched when voices were raised, the careful way she moved through crowds, the defensive posture that suggested someone who had learned to make herself invisible. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Amanda said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I need to tell you something about tomorrow." Elena set down her pen and gave Amanda her full attention. "What is it?" "Caleb and his friends. They're planning something for the assembly. I heard them talking about it in the study hall." Amanda's voice was barely above a whisper. "They said something about embarrassing you in front of everyone. They think it's funny." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Do you know any specifics?" Amanda shook her head. "Just that they want to mess with your dress somehow. They kept laughing about it." She paused, then added, "They don't know I was listening. I'm good at being invisible." "Thank you for telling me," Elena said. "That took courage." Amanda looked surprised. "It did? Absolutely. Speaking up when you see something wrong is one of the hardest things anyone can do. It takes real strength." For the first time since Elena had known her, Amanda smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and uncertain, but it transformed her entire face. "Will you be okay tomorrow?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I think I'll manage. But Amanda, if anything happens during the assembly, I want you to watch carefully. Sometimes the most important lessons aren't the ones we plan to teach." That evening, Elena went through her usual routine with extra care. She prepared her presentation materials, reviewed her notes, and selected her outfit for the following day. She chose a navy blue dress with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves, professional but not formal. The fabric was a sturdy cotton blend, and the cut was fitted but not restrictive. More importantly, she chose her undergarments with the tactical precision of someone who understood that preparation was the difference between victory and defeat. A white blouse worn underneath the dress, invisible from the outside, but ready to preserve her dignity if needed. A small safety pin attached to the inside seam, easy to reach but hidden from view. She laid everything out carefully, then sat down to write. Not lesson plans this time, but a detailed account of every incident involving Caleb Morrison since the beginning of the school year. She documented dates, times, witnesses, and specific behaviors. She described the pattern of escalation, the involvement of his friends, and the apparent planning that had gone into whatever they intended to do at the assembly. The document wasn't meant to be a complaint or a report to administration. It was insurance, a record that would exist regardless of what happened the next day. Elena had learned the importance of documentation in the military, where every action had to be justified and every decision had to be defendable. If tomorrow went badly, she wanted there to be no question about the sequence of events that led to whatever came next. As she wrote, Elena found herself thinking about the different types of courage she had witnessed over the years. There was the obvious kind, the courage of soldiers who ran toward danger instead of away from it. But there was also the quieter kind, like Amanda's decision to speak up despite her fear, or the determination of teachers who came to work every day knowing they were underpaid and underappreciated. And then there was the kind of courage that Elena herself was about to demonstrate, the courage to let someone else make the first move, confident in your ability to respond appropriately when the time came. It was a patience born of training and experience, the understanding that sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent reveal their intentions before showing your own capabilities. She finished writing and read through the document once, before saving it to her laptop and printing a copy for her files. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but she would be ready for it. She had been preparing for this moment, in one way or another, for most of her adult life, outside The evening air was still and heavy with the promise of rain. Elena stood at her kitchen window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one, thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 years ago, she had been sleeping in a tent in Afghanistan, listening to the distant sound of artillery and wondering if she would make it home alive. Now she was standing in her own kitchen, worrying about teenage bullies and school assemblies. But the skills were transferable. The ability to stay calm under pressure, to think tactically about complex situations, to project strength even when feeling vulnerable. These were lessons that applied whether you were dealing with insurgents or 8th graders. The stakes were different, but the principles remained the same. Elena went to bed early that night, setting her alarm for 30 minutes earlier than usual. Tomorrow would require her to be at peak performance, fully alert and completely prepared. She had learned long ago that success in high-pressure situations came down to preparation, timing, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve your objectives. As she drifted off to sleep, Elena's last conscious thought was about Amanda Foster and the shy smile that had transformed her face. Whatever happened tomorrow, Elena was determined that students like Amanda would see that there were adults in the world who wouldn't be intimidated, who wouldn't back down, and who understood that sometimes standing up to bullies required more than just words. The battle lines were drawn. Even if only one side knew it yet, the gymnasium buzzed with the controlled chaos of 500 people finding their seats. Parents clutched programs and searched for good views of the stage, while students shuffled in with the resigned energy of mandatory attendance. Elena stood in the wings, watching the crowd through a gap in the heavy curtains that served as backstage walls. She spotted Caleb immediately. He sat in the 3rd row with Jake and Dylan, close enough to the stage to have a clear view of whatever spectacle they had planned. All 3 boys were expressions of barely contained excitement, the kind of anticipation that came from knowing something others didn't. Caleb kept checking his phone and glancing toward the stage entrance, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. Dr. Holloway approached Elena with her usual pre-event jitters. "Are you ready for your presentation? The microphone is working well today, and the projector is set up for your slides." "Everything's prepared," Elena replied, her voice calm and steady. She had run through her anti-bullying presentation twice that morning, timing each section and memorizing the key points so she wouldn't need to rely heavily on her notes. "Wonderful. You'll be 3rd, right after the parent council update and the budget overview. Should be about 20 minutes from now." Dr. Holloway checked her clipboard anxiously. "I really appreciate you taking this on. The district is pushing hard for these initiatives, and having a teacher present shows our commitment." Elena nodded, watching as more families filed into the gymnasium. She recognized many of the parents from school events, including Mrs. Morrison, Caleb's mother, who had chosen a seat in the front row. The woman wore an expensive blazer and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard at PTA meetings and school board sessions. The first presenter took the stage, and Elena used the time to make final observations. The lighting was bright enough that anyone on stage would have difficulty seeing past the first few rows of the audience. The microphone cord extended about 8 feet from the podium, giving the speaker room to move, but not much. The stairs on either side of the stage were narrow and steep, designed more for function than safety. Most importantly, Elena noted the positioning of the faculty. Teachers were seated in a reserved section to the left of the stage, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough away that they wouldn't automatically be part of whatever was about to unfold. The administration sat at a table on the stage itself, but they would be behind the podium when she spoke, unable to see what might be happening in front of her. The parent council president finished her remarks to polite applause, and the budget presentation began. Elena used the time to center herself, drawing on techniques she had learned during her deployment. She controlled her breathing, relaxed her shoulders, and cleared her mind of everything except the immediate task ahead. She wasn't nervous about the presentation itself. Public speaking had never bothered her, and she genuinely believed in the anti-bullying message she was about to deliver. What made her pulse quicken slightly was the certainty that Caleb's plan was about to unfold, and her own plan was about to be tested. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you're up next," whispered the student assistant who was helping coordinate the program. Elena nodded and moved closer to the stage entrance. Dr. Holloway took the microphone. "Our next presenter is Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, who teaches 8th grade English here at Oakwood. Mrs. Rodriguez will be sharing information about our new anti-bullying initiative and the resources available to our students and families." Elena walked onto the stage to moderate applause, her heels clicking confidently on the wooden platform. She approached the podium with measured steps, placed her notes on the surface, and adjusted the microphone with practiced ease. The bright stage lights made it difficult to see individual faces in the audience, but she could sense the attention focused on her. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here tonight." Her voice carried clearly through the gymnasium sound system. "Tonight I want to talk about something that affects every family in this room, the challenge of creating a school environment where every student feels safe, respected, and valued." She began her presentation smoothly, clicking through slides that showed statistics about bullying, examples of positive intervention strategies, and resources for reporting incidents. The audience was attentive, and several parents nodded along with her points about the importance of bystander intervention. Elena was midway through a slide about recognizing warning signs when she sensed movement near the edge of the stage. Her peripheral vision caught Jake Patterson creeping along the wall, staying low and moving with the exaggerated stealth of someone who thought he was being clever. She continued speaking without missing a beat, but her awareness sharpened to combat levels. "Research shows that bullying behavior often escalates when there are no consequences for smaller acts of aggression," she said, advancing to the next slide while tracking Jake's movement. "Students who engage in bullying frequently test boundaries, starting with minor infractions and building toward more serious violations." Jake had reached the side stairs and was climbing them slowly, staying just outside the main pool of stage lights. Elena caught sight of something thin and nearly invisible in his hand, fishing line, exactly as she had suspected. He was moving toward the back of the stage, positioning himself behind where she stood. "The key to effective intervention," Elena continued, her voice never wavering, "is recognizing these patterns early and responding appropriately." She took a step to her left, ostensibly to gesture toward the projection screen, but actually to get a better angle on Jake's position. The boy had reached the back corner of the stage and was tying one end of the fishing line to something. Elena couldn't see what without turning around completely. She maintained her presentation while calculating distances and timing. Whatever they had planned, it would happen soon. "Sometimes," Elena said, clicking to a new slide titled "Consequences and Accountability," "people mistake tolerance for weakness. They assume that because someone chooses not to retaliate immediately, that person is unable or unwilling to defend themselves." In the audience, Caleb shifted forward in his seat. Dylan pulled out his phone, holding it at an angle that suggested he was preparing to record. Several other students in the front rows seemed unusually alert, as if they sensed something was about to happen. Elena advanced to her final slide. "The most important thing we can teach our children is that there's a difference between avoiding conflict and being unable to handle it. Sometimes the strongest response is the one that comes when someone has pushed too far." She felt the fishing line brush against her shoulder blade, so light she might have missed it if she hadn't been expecting it. Jake had attached the other end to her dress. She realized, probably at the seam where the zipper met the fabric. The plan was becoming clear when she moved or turned, The line would catch and tear the dress, likely splitting it open down the back. Are there any questions about the resources we've discussed tonight? Elena asked, knowing that this was the moment Caleb expected her to step away from the podium and turn to face the audience more directly. Several hands went up around the gymnasium. Elena smiled and pointed to a parent in the middle section. Yes, you have a question? As the parent began to speak, Elena did exactly what Caleb expected her to do. She stepped to her left, moving away from the podium to address the questioner more directly. The fishing line pulled taut against her dress, but instead of the spectacular wardrobe malfunction Caleb had envisioned, something else happened entirely. Elena had been ready for this moment, and she had prepared accordingly. As the line pulled against the seam of her dress, she felt the deliberate tear she had made that morning open slightly, exactly as she had planned it. The dress split, but not catastrophically. Instead of exposing her back, the controlled tear revealed the white blouse she wore underneath, creating what looked like an intentional design element rather than a humiliating accident. Elena felt the tug, heard the small sound of tearing fabric, and continued answering the parent's question without missing a beat. To the audience, it appeared as though nothing had happened. But she could see Caleb's face in the front row, his expression shifting from anticipation to confusion as he realized his plan wasn't working as intended. Thank you for that excellent question, Elena said, moving back toward the podium with fluid grace. As she walked, the fishing line caught her foot. Instead of stumbling, she bent gracefully and picked up the nearly invisible strand, holding it up to the light so the entire audience could see it. It appears, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, that someone has left some fishing line on our stage. We certainly want to keep our learning environment safe for everyone. The gymnasium fell silent. Elena's tone was pleasant, conversational, but there was something in her posture that commanded absolute attention. She wound the fishing line around her fingers with deliberate precision, her movements controlled and purposeful. You know, she continued, stepping closer to the edge of the stage where Caleb sat frozen in his seat. This actually provides a perfect example of what we've been discussing tonight. Sometimes people think they're being clever when they're really just revealing their character. The silence in the gymnasium was now complete. Even the youngest children seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though they might not understand exactly what. Elena looked directly at Caleb Morrison, her gray eyes holding his with an intensity that made him sink lower in his seat. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, but somehow reached every corner of the room. The thing about bullies, she said, is that they always underestimate their targets. They assume that kindness means weakness, that patience means powerlessness, and that someone who chooses not to fight back is someone who can't fight back. She paused, letting the words settle over the audience like dust after an explosion. They're usually wrong about that. The fishing line hung from Elena's fingers like evidence at a crime scene. In the front row, Mrs. Morrison's face had drained of color as she stared at her son, who looked like he wanted to disappear through the gymnasium floor. The other parents began murmuring, connecting dots that painted an uncomfortable picture of premeditated humiliation. Elena set the fishing line on the podium with deliberate care. Before we conclude tonight's presentation, I think it's important to address what just happened here, because this is exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to prevent. Dr. Holloway stood up from the administrative table, her face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. Mrs. Rodriguez, perhaps we should handle this privately? Elena's voice cut through the principal's attempt at damage control. With respect, Dr. Holloway, privacy is what allows this behavior to continue. These students plan to humiliate me in front of this entire community. I think it's appropriate that the community see how we respond to such actions. She turned back to the audience, her posture straight and commanding. For the first time since stepping on stage, her military bearing was fully visible. Parents who had been chatting quietly fell silent, sensing a shift in the energy of the room. "I want to tell you all something about myself that I don't usually share," Elena said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the gymnasium. "Before I became a teacher, I served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan as a communications specialist. With the United States Army, I've been in situations where people tried to intimidate me, where they tested my resolve, and where they assumed my composure meant I was weak." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Several parents straightened in their seats, and Elena could see teachers exchanging glances in the faculty section. "During my deployment, I learned that respect isn't something you demand or manipulate people into giving you. It's something you earn through your actions, your integrity, and your willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Elena stepped away from the podium entirely now, moving with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I also learned that people who try to tear others down, who find entertainment in humiliation and cruelty, reveal far more about themselves than they do about their targets." In the third row, Caleb had slumped so low in his seat that he was almost horizontal. Jake Patterson, who had been trying to sneak off the back of the stage, froze when Elena's gaze swept past him. "Jake," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone she had stepped away from, "would you mind rejoining us? I think it's important that everyone see who was involved in this little demonstration." The boy looked like a deer caught in headlights. Several hundred pairs of eyes turned toward him as he stood awkwardly at the back of the stage, his face burning red with embarrassment. "Come here, please," Elena said. It wasn't a request. Jake shuffled forward, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. When he reached the center of the stage, Elena positioned him beside her where the entire audience could see him clearly. Jake helped execute this plan by climbing onto the stage and attaching fishing line to my dress, Elena explained to the audience. "The intention was to tear my clothing when I moved, presumably creating a moment of humiliation that would be recorded and shared." She gestured toward the front rows where Dylan still held his phone, though he had lowered it and was trying to look invisible. Dylan was positioned to record the incident, while Caleb orchestrated the entire operation from his seat in the audience. Mrs. Morrison stood up abruptly. "Now wait just a minute. You can't accuse my son without proof." "Ma'am," Elena interrupted, her voice remaining calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "Your son has been escalating his behavior in my classroom for weeks. I have documentation of every incident, including his stated intention to embarrass me at this assembly. Jake's presence on this stage with the fishing line isn't a coincidence." She turned to address the entire audience again. "This brings me to the real lesson I want to share tonight. Bullying doesn't happen in a vacuum. It thrives in environments where adults make excuses, where consequences are avoided, and where victims are expected to suffer in silence for the sake of keeping peace." Dr. Holloway shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Elena could see the principal calculating the political ramifications of this public confrontation, weighing the complaints she would receive against the support she might gain. "I could have ignored this incident," Elena continued. "I could have pretended the fishing line was an accident, allowed these boys to think their plan had failed due to luck rather than preparation. But that would have taught them that they could continue this behavior without consequences." She walked to the edge of the stage, bringing herself closer to the audience. "Instead, I want to teach a different lesson. When someone targets you for humiliation, when they plan to tear you down for their entertainment, you have choices. You can accept it, you can hide from it, or you can stand up and show them that you're stronger than they imagined." Amanda Foster sat in the middle section with her parents, her eyes wide with attention. Elena caught her gaze and nodded slightly, a gesture that seemed to straighten the girl's spine. "The fishing line attached to my dress tonight was meant to create a moment of vulnerability," Elena said. "What these students didn't know is that I prepared for their attack. I reinforced the scene they targeted, wore appropriate undergarments, and positioned myself to control the situation. Several parents were now looking at their own children with new awareness, perhaps wondering what behaviors they had overlooked or excused. But more importantly, Elena continued, I documented every incident that led to this moment. I have records of classroom disruptions, hallway intimidation, and the pattern of escalation that brought us here tonight. I didn't just prepare to defend myself. I prepared to ensure accountability. She turned to Jake, who was still standing beside her like a statue. Jake, do you want to explain to everyone why you brought fishing line to a school assembly? The boy's mouth opened and closed without sound. He looked desperately toward Caleb, but his friend was studiously avoiding eye contact. That's all right, Elena said. Your silence speaks for itself. She addressed the audience one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what bullying looks like when it's confronted directly. These students believed they could humiliate a teacher in front of the entire school community without consequences. They believed that because I hadn't retaliated against previous incidents, I was incapable of defending myself. The gymnasium was absolutely silent now. Even the youngest children seemed to understand they were witnessing something significant. They were wrong, Elena said simply. And I hope this serves as a lesson not just to them, but to any other students who might be considering similar actions. Kindness is not weakness. Patience is not powerlessness. And choosing not to fight doesn't mean you can't win when the fight comes to you. She walked back to the podium and picked up her notes. That concludes my presentation on our anti-bullying initiative. I think we've covered all the important points. The silence stretched for several seconds before someone in the back of the gymnasium began to clap. The applause started slowly, uncertainly, but built steadily as more parents joined in. Soon the entire audience was applauding, with the notable exception of the Morrison family and a few other parents who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Elena stood calmly at the podium, accepting the applause without emotion. She had said what needed to be said, done what needed to be done. The rest would unfold as it would. Dr. Holloway finally stood up, her face a mask of professional composure, despite the chaos she was undoubtedly feeling. Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez, for that illuminating presentation. I think we should move on to our final speaker of the evening. But Elena wasn't finished yet. Actually, Dr. Holloway, I think we need to address the immediate situation. Jake, you can return to your seat. Now, Caleb and Dylan, please come to the front of the gymnasium. The principal looked like she wanted to object, but the expectant attention of 500 community members made protest impossible. Caleb and Dylan reluctantly stood up and walked toward the stage, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. I'll be meeting with all three of these students first thing Monday morning, Elena announced, along with their parents and the appropriate administrators. This behavior ends now. As the two boys joined Jake at the front of the room, Elena felt a familiar satisfaction, the same feeling she had experienced when a mission was completed successfully. Not joy, not anger, just the quiet confidence that came from executing a plan perfectly and achieving the desired outcome. The assembly would continue for another 20 minutes, but Elena Rodriguez had already said everything she needed to say. The message had been delivered clearly, publicly, and with precision. Now it was time to see how the rest of the school community would respond. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that follows a thunderstorm. Elena walked through the hallways of Oakwood Middle School at 6:45 a.m., an hour before students would begin arriving, and found the building transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Teachers who had previously offered only polite nods now made direct eye contact. The custodial staff, who had always been friendly, seemed to carry themselves with a new respect in her presence. In the main office, Dr. Holloway was already waiting with 3 file folders spread across her desk and a coffee cup that suggested she had been there much longer than usual. The principal looked up when Elena entered, her expression unreadable but alert. "Good morning, Elena. I've been reviewing the documentation you mentioned Friday night." Dr. Holloway gestured to the folders. "You've been quite thorough." Elena took the offered seat across from the principal's desk. Documentation protects everyone involved. The students, the school, and the teachers who have to make difficult decisions. "Speaking of difficult decisions," Dr. Holloway said, "I've been fielding phone calls since Saturday morning. About half are complaints from parents who think you went too far. The other half are expressing support for finally addressing the behavior directly." Elena wasn't surprised. Public confrontations always created polarized reactions, dividing people between those who believed in accountability and those who preferred problems to be handled quietly, where they could be minimized or ignored entirely. "The Morrison family has requested a meeting with the district superintendent," Dr. Holloway continued. "They're claiming their son was publicly humiliated without due process." "He was publicly embarrassed by his own actions," Elena corrected. "Due process would have happened weeks ago if previous incidents had been properly addressed." Dr. Holloway leaned back in her chair, studying Elena's face. "You know, when I hired you, I thought you were exactly what this school needed. Someone calm, professional, unlikely to cause waves. I'm beginning to think I misjudged the situation entirely." "You hired me to teach students and maintain classroom order," Elena replied. "That's exactly what I'm doing. The methods might be different from what you expected, but the results speak for themselves." At 7:30, the first of the three families arrived. The Pattersons entered the office with the defensive posture of parents who knew their child was in trouble but hadn't yet decided whether to acknowledge it or fight it. Jake's father, a tall man in a work shirt who looked like he preferred direct conversation, shook Elena's hand with surprising firmness. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, "Jake told us what happened. He also told us about the things leading up to it. I want you to know that his mother and I don't approve of what he did." Jake sat between his parents, smaller than he had seemed on stage, his eyes fixed on his hands. When Elena spoke to him directly, he flinched as if expecting harsh words. "Jake, I need you to understand something," Elena said, her voice calm but serious. "What you did Friday night wasn't just a prank. You planned to humiliate an adult in front of her colleagues and community. That's not childhood mischief. That's a serious failure of judgment and respect." The boy nodded miserably. "I'm sorry. Caleb said it would just be funny, that you wouldn't really care." "And what do you think now?" Elena asked. Jake looked up for the first time since sitting down. "I think Caleb was wrong about a lot of things." His father leaned forward. "What kind of consequences are we looking at here?" Dr. Holloway consulted her notes. 3-day suspension, mandatory counseling sessions about bullying and respect, and a written apology to Mrs. Rodriguez that will be shared with the school community." "That seems fair," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "What else can we do to make this right?" Elena had been hoping for this question. "Jake could help me with my anti-bullying presentations to other classes. Sometimes, hearing from someone who made a mistake can be more powerful than hearing from someone who always did the right thing." The suggestion surprised everyone in the room, including Jake, who looked up with something that might have been hope. "You'd want me to help you?" "I'd want you to help other students avoid making the same choices you made," Elena clarified. "But only if you're genuinely committed to understanding why what you did was wrong." The Cruz family arrived next, and the conversation followed a similar pattern. Dylan's parents were mortified by their son's behavior and fully supportive of whatever consequences the school deemed appropriate. Dylan himself seemed relieved to finally have the whole situation out in the open, admitting that he had been uncomfortable with the plan from the beginning but hadn't known how to back out without losing face with his friends. The Morrison meeting was different entirely. Mrs. Morrison entered with the bearing of someone preparing for battle. accompanied by her husband and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the family's attorney. Caleb trailed behind them, his usual confidence replaced by sullen resentment. "Before we begin," the attorney said, "I want to state for the record that my clients believe this entire situation has been handled inappropriately. Publicly humiliating a minor student violates several district policies regarding disciplinary procedures." Elena had expected this approach. Mr. Caleb Morrison publicly attempted to humiliate a teacher in front of 500 community members. The humiliation he experienced was a direct result of his own actions being exposed, not any action taken against him. "You deliberately embarrassed him in front of his peers and their families," Mrs. Morrison interjected. "That's not appropriate behavior from an educator. Neither is planning to tear a teacher's clothing off in front of an audience," Elena replied evenly. "Would you prefer that I had allowed the humiliation to proceed as your son planned it?" Dr. Holloway stepped in before the conversation could escalate further. "Let's focus on moving forward constructively. Caleb, do you understand why your behavior was unacceptable?" The boy shifted in his chair, his expression defiant. "I understand that nobody can take a joke anymore. It was supposed to be funny." The room fell silent. Elena studied Caleb's face, seeing the same arrogance that had marked his behavior for weeks, now mixed with embarrassment, but not genuine remorse. "Caleb," Elena said, "if someone had planned to tear your mother's dress in front of a large audience, would you consider that funny?" Mrs. Morrison's face flushed. "That's completely different. It's exactly the same," Elena interrupted. "Your son planned to expose me physically in front of my colleagues, my students, and their families. The only difference is that I was prepared for his attack and he wasn't prepared for the consequences." The attorney consulted his notes. "We're prepared to accept a suspension and counseling requirement, but we object to any public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. That could affect Caleb's future academic and athletic opportunities." Elena looked directly at Caleb. "Your behavior is already affecting your future opportunities. The question is whether you're going to learn from this experience or continue down the same path until the consequences become much more serious." Dr. Holloway outlined the school's proposed consequences: a 5-day suspension, mandatory counseling, removal from all extracurricular activities for the remainder of the semester, and a public apology to be read during morning announcements. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Morrison said immediately. "We will not subject our son to further public humiliation." "Then you're missing the point entirely," Elena said. "Public accountability isn't humiliation, it's responsibility. Your son committed his offense publicly, with the intention of creating maximum embarrassment for his target. The consequences should match the scope of the behavior." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes with the Morrison family, ultimately agreeing to the suspension and counseling, but refusing the public apology. Elena accepted the compromise, knowing that the real message had already been delivered during the assembly. As the families left, Dr. Holloway remained behind with Elena. "You know this isn't over, don't you? The Morrisons have connections on the school board. They'll try to make this about your methods rather than their son's behavior." Elena gathered her documentation and stood to leave. "Let them try. Everything I did was measured, appropriate, and effective. Sometimes standing up to bullies means accepting that some people will see you as the problem rather than the solution." That afternoon, Elena returned to her classroom to find a small pile of notes on her desk. Students had been leaving them throughout the day, some thanking her for standing up to Caleb, others sharing their own experiences with bullying, and a few expressing admiration for her military service. Amanda Foster's note was the longest. "Mrs. Rodriguez, watching you Friday night was like seeing someone turn on a light in a dark room. You showed all of us that we don't have to accept being treated badly just because it's easier than fighting back. Thank you for being brave enough to stand up, and for teaching us that we can be brave too." Elena read each note carefully, filing them away with the same precision she used for all important documents. The battle with Caleb Morrison was over, but the war against institutional tolerance for bullying was just beginning. She had fired the first shot publicly and decisively. Now she would see who was willing to join the fight. 3 weeks after the assembly, Elena noticed the silence first. Not the oppressive quiet of fear, but the focused attention of students who had finally found something worth listening to. Her 8th grade English classes had transformed from exercises in crowd control into genuine discussions about character, consequence, and courage. The change wasn't universal. Some students remained skeptical, waiting to see if Elena's moment of strength would fade back into the accommodating patience most adults eventually displayed. But others had awakened to possibilities they hadn't previously considered. The idea that respect could be demanded rather than hoped for, that boundaries could be enforced rather than suggested. Amanda Foster had become a different person entirely. The shy girl who once made herself invisible now raised her hand regularly, contributed thoughtful observations, and had even volunteered to read her essay on moral courage to the class. When Elena complimented her work, Amanda no longer looked surprised by the attention. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Amanda approached her desk after class one Thursday afternoon. "I wanted to tell you something. My mom said she's been getting calls from other parents about what happened at the assembly." Elena looked up from the papers she was grading. "What kind of calls?" "Good ones mostly. Parents saying they wish their kids had teachers who weren't afraid to stand up to bullies. But also some bad ones." Amanda hesitated. "Some people are saying you went too far, that you embarrassed those boys unfairly." Elena had expected this. Public confrontations always created division, forcing people to choose sides in conflicts they preferred to ignore. "What do you think, Amanda?" The girl considered the question seriously. "I think those people weren't in our classes every day watching what Caleb and his friends did to other students. They didn't see how you tried to handle it quietly at first. They just saw the end result and decided it was too harsh." "That's a very mature perspective," Elena said. "Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that not everyone will understand or support your choices." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the classroom door. Elena looked up to see Jake Patterson standing in the doorway, his posture uncertain but determined. "Mrs. Rodriguez, could I talk to you for a minute?" Elena gestured for him to come in. Since his suspension ended, Jake had been a model student, attentive, respectful, and seemingly genuine in his efforts to make amends. He had also begun eating lunch alone, having been effectively ostracized by his former friends. "I wanted to ask you about the presentation offer you made," Jake said. "About helping with the anti-bullying talks. Are you still willing to let me do that?" Elena studied his face. The cocky teenager who had climbed onto the stage with fishing line had been replaced by someone who seemed older, more thoughtful. "Why do you want to help?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Because I keep thinking about what you said, about how we plan to humiliate you in front of everyone. I never really thought about it that way before, you know. Like we just thought it would be funny to embarrass a teacher. We didn't think about how it would feel to be you." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And now I keep seeing other kids doing stuff, not as bad as what we did, but mean stuff, and I want to tell them they should stop. But I don't know how to say it without sounding like a hypocrite." Elena nodded slowly. "Acknowledging that you made mistakes doesn't make you a hypocrite, Jake. It makes you someone who learned from experience. That's actually more valuable than someone who never made the mistake in the first place." "Really? Really? Students will listen to you because you've been where they are. You understand the thinking that leads to those choices." Elena pulled out her lesson planning notebook. "I'm doing a presentation to the 7th grade classes next week. If you're serious about this, you can help me." Jake's face brightened with something that looked like relief. "I am serious. I really want to help." After Jake left, Elena remained at her desk thinking about the complex dynamics that had emerged since the assembly. The incident had created clear winners and losers, but also a significant middle group of students and parents who were still processing what they had witnessed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Holloway. "Please see me before you leave today. We need to discuss the district meeting." Elena had been expecting this conversation. The Morrison family's attorney had followed through on his threat to escalate the matter to the district level, claiming that Elena's actions constituted unprofessional conduct and public humiliation of a minor student. She found Dr. Holloway in her office at 4:15, looking tired and slightly frazzled. The principal gestured to a chair across from her desk, where a formal letter lay waiting. "The district has scheduled a hearing for next Tuesday," Dr. Holloway said without preamble. "They'll be reviewing the entire incident, including your handling of the situation and the appropriateness of your response." Elena picked up the letter and scanned its contents. The language was formal and neutral, but she could read between the lines. Someone with influence wanted her disciplined, possibly removed, and they were willing to use official channels to make it happen. "What's your assessment of the situation?" Elena asked. Dr. Holloway leaned back in her chair. "Honestly, I think you did exactly what needed to be done. But I also think the Morrison family has more political influence than any of us anticipated. Mrs. Morrison sits on the hospital board with 2 school board members, and her husband's construction company has contracts with the district." Elena wasn't surprised. Institutional pressure often came from sources that had nothing to do with education, but everything to do with power and connections. "The superintendent will be looking for a way to satisfy the complaint without completely undermining you, Dr. Holloway continued. "Probably some kind of reprimand or requirement for additional training on student discipline procedures. And if I refuse to accept a reprimand for defending myself against a planned attack?" Dr. Holloway met her eyes. "Then this could become a much bigger battle than anyone wants." Elena folded the letter and placed it in her bag. "Some battles are worth fighting, regardless of what anyone wants." That evening, Elena sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, drafting a detailed response to the district's inquiry. She outlined every incident involving Caleb Morrison, every attempt at progressive discipline that had been ignored or undermined, and every piece of documentation she had accumulated over the course of the semester. But more importantly, she began documenting something else: the positive changes that had emerged since the assembly. The increase in students reporting bullying incidents, the improvement in classroom behavior across multiple classes, the requests from other teachers for advice on handling disruptive students. Amanda Foster wasn't the only student who had been transformed by witnessing someone stand up to institutional indifference. Elena had received emails from parents describing children who were now more willing to speak up about problems, more confident in their interactions with peers, and more interested in discussions about ethics and personal responsibility. Her phone rang at 8:30. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, she heard a familiar voice. "Mrs. Rodriguez? This is Captain Martinez from the VA hospital. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the Veterans Services Directory." Elena was surprised but pleased to hear from him. Captain Martinez had been her group counselor during her transition back to civilian life, helping her process her military experience and adjust to life outside the structured environment she had known for years. "Captain Martinez, it's good to hear from you. What's going on? I've been hearing some interesting things about you through the Veterans Network. Something about a teacher who reminded everyone that military training doesn't just disappear when you take off the uniform." Elena smiled. The veterans community was smaller and more connected than most people realized. Word traveled fast when one of their own made news. "I simply handled a difficult situation using the skills I learned in service," Elena said. "Nothing more complicated than that." Maybe not complicated, but definitely effective. I've had 3 parents call me this week asking about programs that teach kids the kind of confidence and self-respect you demonstrated. They want their children to learn how to stand up for themselves, the way you stood up for yourself. Elena hadn't considered this possibility. What kind of programs? Leadership workshops, conflict resolution training, personal integrity seminars, basically civilian versions of the character development we get in military training. Parents are realizing that their kids need to learn how to handle bullies and stand up to peer pressure, and they want instructors who actually know what they're talking about. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Captain Martinez describing opportunities that Elena had never imagined. Teaching wasn't just about English literature and essay writing. It could be about character development, leadership, training, and helping young people develop the kind of inner strength that would serve them throughout their lives. After hanging up, Elena returned to her laptop and began writing a different kind of document. Not just a defense of her actions, but a proposal for expanding anti-bullying efforts throughout the district. If the Morrison family wanted to make this a bigger battle, she was prepared to fight on terms that went far beyond one incident in Kofa. One gymnasium. The hearing was still a week away, but Elena Rodriguez was no longer thinking defensively. She was thinking strategically, the way she had been trained to think when faced with complex challenges that required both courage and intelligence. Assembly had been the opening move in a larger campaign. Now it was time to plan the next phase. The district hearing room smelled of old coffee and institutional disinfectant. Elena arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 3 months of documentation, character references from fellow veterans, and letters of support from parents whose children had been transformed by what they witnessed at the assembly. 5 school board members sat behind a curved table that elevated them above the rest of the room. Superintendent Dr. Patricia Wells occupied the center position, her expression carefully neutral as she reviewed the files spread before her. To Elena's left sat the Morrison family with their attorney, while Dr. Holloway represented the school's position at a separate table. This hearing, Dr. Wells began, is to review allegations of inappropriate conduct by Mrs. Elena Rodriguez during a school assembly on October 15th. Mrs. Rodriguez, you are not being charged with any violation at this time, but we need to determine whether your actions were consistent with district policies and professional standards. Elena stood when invited to speak. She had prepared extensively for this moment, but she also understood that preparation meant being ready to adapt when circumstances required flexibility. Dr. Wells, board members, I want to begin by stating clearly that I stand behind every action I took that evening. For 3 months, I documented a pattern of escalating harassment directed at me by students who believed they could act without consequences. When they planned to humiliate me publicly, I responded by holding them publicly accountable. She opened her portfolio and removed a thick folder. I have here detailed records of every incident, every attempted intervention, and every failure of the normal disciplinary process to address the behavior effectively. I also have documentation of the positive changes that have occurred since students realize that actions have consequences. The Morrison family's attorney, Mr. Hendricks, leaned forward. Dr. Wells, we're not here to relitigate teenage behavior. We're here because a teacher chose to humiliate minor children in front of their families and community. Mrs. Rodriguez turned what should have been a private disciplinary matter into a public spectacle. Elena remained standing. Mr. Hendricks, your clients planned a public spectacle. They intended to tear my clothing in front of 500 people, with cameras recording the incident for social media distribution. The only difference between their plan and what actually happened is that I was prepared for their attack. Board member David Chun spoke up. Mrs. Rodriguez, couldn't this situation have been handled through normal channels? Suspension, parent. Conferences, Progressive discipline. Mr. Chun, normal channels failed repeatedly. I have documentation showing that previous complaints about these students were minimized, ignored, or resulted in consequences so mild they were interpreted as permission to escalate. Elena walked to the center of the room, positioning herself where she could address all 5 board members directly. But I want to talk about what happened after the assembly, because that's where you'll find the real measure of whether my actions were appropriate. She opened a second folder. Amanda Foster, a student who hadn't spoken in class for 2 months, is now actively participating in discussions and has volunteered to help mentor younger students. Jake Patterson, one of the students involved in the incident, has genuinely apologized and is now working with me to prevent other students from making the same mistakes. Elena pulled out a stack of letters. These are from parents whose children witnessed what happened. Not all of them supported my methods initially, but they're writing to tell you about positive changes they've seen in their kids. Children who are more willing to report bullying, more confident in standing up for themselves, and more interested in discussions about character and integrity. Dr. Wells examined the letters Elena handed her. These are certainly positive developments, but we also have concerns about the precedent your actions might set. Teachers can't simply take matters into their own hands when they disagree with administrative decisions. Elena had anticipated this argument. Dr. Wells, I didn't disagree with an administrative decision. I responded to a physical attack during a public event when no administrator was in position to intervene. The fishing line was attached to my dress while I was speaking. By the time any administrator could have responded, the damage would have been done. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. I want to ask the board a question. If someone had planned to tear the superintendent's clothing during a public presentation, would you expect her to stand quietly and allow it to happen for the sake of avoiding conflict? The room fell silent. Elena could see several board members shifting uncomfortably, recognizing the trap in the question. If they said yes, they would be advocating for victims to accept humiliation passively. If they said no, they would be acknowledging that Elena's response was appropriate. Mr. Hendricks tried to redirect. That's a false equivalency. The superintendent wouldn't be dealing with children. Mr. Hendricks, Elena replied, your client is 14 years old, not 4. At what age do we start expecting people to understand that planning to humiliate others is wrong? At what age do consequences become appropriate? She turned back to the board. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where I learned that leadership means taking responsibility for your actions and accepting the consequences of your choices. These students planned their attack for weeks. They coordinated roles, brought materials, and positioned themselves to record the results. This wasn't impulse or poor judgment, it was premeditation. Board member Sarah Kim spoke for the first time. Mrs. Rodriguez, what would you have done differently if you could relive that evening? Elena considered the question carefully. I would have documented the threat more extensively beforehand and involved law enforcement, since planning to physically assault someone at a public event could constitute criminal behavior. The suggestion clearly surprised everyone in the room. Mrs. Morrison's face went pale, and even Mr. Hendricks looked taken aback. However, Elena continued, I chose to handle the situation educationally rather than criminally. I used the incident as a teaching moment about consequences, accountability, and the difference between victims and survivors. Dr. Wells consulted. Her notes. Mrs. Rodriguez, the district is prepared to offer you a reprimand with mandatory training on student discipline procedures, along with a requirement that future incidents be handled through administrative channels. Elena had expected this offer. It was the bureaucratic solution. Acknowledge wrongdoing without admitting fault. Provide training that wouldn't change anything, and create policies that would prevent future effectiveness. Dr. Wells, I cannot accept a reprimand for defending myself against a planned attack. If the district believes that teachers should passively accept humiliation and assault, then I cannot work within that system." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Elena could see Dr. Holloway looking nervous, the board members exchanging glances, and Mr. Hendricks beginning to smile with anticipation. "However," Elena continued, "I am prepared to offer the district something more valuable than my resignation." She pulled out her final folder. "Captain Martinez from the Veterans Administration has been working with me to develop a comprehensive character education program based on military leadership principles. We have preliminary approval to pilot the program in 3 districts, with federal funding available for implementation." Elena placed the proposal on Dr. Wells' desk. "This program teaches students the same principles I learned in service: personal accountability, respect for others, leadership through service, and the courage to stand up for what's right. It's designed to prevent the kind of incident we experienced, by building character rather than just punishing poor choices." Board member Chun leaned forward with interest. "What kind of federal funding are we talking about?" "The initial pilot program comes with a 3-year, $2.8 million grant. Successful completion could lead to permanent funding and expansion throughout the state." Elena could see the calculation happening in real time. The Morrison family's complaint had suddenly become much less important than a multi-million-dollar opportunity that would bring positive attention to the district. "The Veterans Administration specifically requested me as the lead coordinator," Elena added. "They want someone who has both classroom experience and military leadership background. The position would require district support and administrative backing." Dr. Wells looked at the proposal, then at Elena, then at the board members who were nodding with obvious interest. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said finally, "would you be willing to accept a formal commendation for innovative problem-solving, in lieu of any disciplinary action?" Elena allowed herself a small smile. "I think that would be appropriate." Mr. Hendricks stood up abruptly. "This is completely unacceptable. You're rewarding behavior that violated district policies and humiliated my clients." Elena turned to face him directly. "Mr. Hendricks, your clients humiliated themselves by planning to assault a teacher in front of their community. The only thing I did was make sure their plan failed and their behavior had consequences." Dr. Wells gavelled the hearing to a close. "The board will take both the disciplinary matter and the grant proposal under consideration. We'll have a decision within 48 hours. As people began filing out of the room, Elena gathered her materials with the same methodical precision she had brought to every aspect of this conflict. She had come prepared for battle and discovered an opportunity for something much more significant. Amanda Foster was waiting in the hallway outside, having convinced her parents to bring her to observe the hearing. When Elena emerged, the girl rushed forward with excitement. "Mrs. Rodriguez, how did it go?" Elena looked down at this student who had found her voice because someone had finally shown her what courage looked like in action. "Amanda," she said, "I think we're just getting started." 6 months later, Elena stood in front of a new classroom filled with students from 3 different schools, teaching the first session of the Veterans Leadership Academy. Jake Patterson sat in the front row, having become one of the program's most effective peer mentors. Amanda Foster helped coordinate presentations to younger students about standing up to bullying. And somewhere in the back of her desk drawer, Elena kept the fishing line from that October evening, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that teach everyone involved the difference between winning and being right. The assembly had lasted 2 hours. The changes it set in motion would last much longer. The Veterans Leadership Academy occupied 3 classrooms in the renovated East Wing of Oakwood Middle School, its walls decorated with maps, leadership principles, and photos from student community service projects. Elena walked through the space at dawn, checking equipment and reviewing the day's curriculum before her first cohort of student leaders arrived. The program had exceeded every expectation. What began as a defensive strategy during a disciplinary hearing had evolved into something that was transforming not just individual students, but the entire culture of the school district. The waiting list for next semester's program stretched to over 200 applicants from 7 different schools. Captain Martinez arrived at 7:30, carrying coffee and a folder of new applications. As the program's military liaison, he visited twice weekly to observe sessions and provide guidance on adapting military leadership principles for civilian education. "Elena, you need to see these," he said, spreading photos across her desk. "These are from the Pine Valley Middle School presentation yesterday." The images showed students from Elena's program leading anti-bullying workshops at neighboring schools. Jake Patterson stood at a podium, speaking to an auditorium of 7th graders about the consequences of mob mentality and the courage required to change course when you've made mistakes. His transformation from perpetrator to advocate had become one of the program's most powerful success stories. "He's getting requests to speak at high schools now," Captain Martinez said. "Apparently, hearing about mistakes from someone who actually made them carries more weight than lectures from adults who never went down that path." Elena smiled, remembering the sullen boy who had climbed onto the stage with fishing lines 6 months earlier. Jake's discovered that redemption requires action, not just apology. He's working harder to make amends than he ever worked to cause trouble. Amanda Foster entered the classroom carrying a stack of journals from the previous day's session. As the program's student coordinator, she had developed organizational skills that surprised everyone, including herself. The shy girl who once made herself invisible now managed schedules, coordinated events, and mentored incoming students with quiet efficiency. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the District Curriculum Committee wants to observe our conflict resolution session this afternoon," Amanda said. "They're considering adopting our peer mediation model for all middle schools in the county." The expansion possibilities seemed endless. 3 other states had requested information about replicating the program, and the Department of Education had reached out about including it in a national study on innovative anti-bullying interventions. Elena had never imagined that standing up to 3 bullying students would lead to systematic change across multiple educational systems. The ripple effects continued expanding in directions she couldn't have predicted. "There's something else," Captain Martinez said. "I got a call from Senator Williams' office yesterday. She wants to include our program in her veterans transition bill. If it passes, we could see federal funding for similar programs in every state." Elena paused in her lesson planning. The scope of what they had built still surprised her sometimes. What would that look like practically? Training centers for veteran educators, standardized curriculum development, and partnership agreements with school districts nationwide. You'd essentially be creating a new career path for military personnel transitioning to civilian education. The idea was both exciting and daunting. Elena had never sought to become a national figure or educational innovator. She had simply refused to accept that bullying was an inevitable part of the school experience. At 8:15, students began arriving for the morning session. The group included natural leaders like Amanda, reformed troublemakers like Jake, and quiet achievers who had found their voices through the program's emphasis on authentic leadership. Today's lesson focused on institutional change, how individuals could influence systems that seemed too large or entrenched to modify. Elena began by sharing her own experience with the district hearing, explaining how preparation, documentation, and strategic thinking had transformed a potential punishment into an opportunity for expansion. "The key principle," she explained, to the 24 students seated in a circle, "is understanding that systems change when they're presented with better alternatives, not just criticism of current practices." Marcus Chun, a 8th grader who had joined the program after being repeatedly targeted by older students, raised his hand. "But what if the people in charge of the system don't want it to change?" "Then you have to make change more attractive." "Then staying the same," Elena replied. "When I was facing discipline for the assembly incident, I didn't just defend my actions. I offered the district something they wanted more than they wanted to punish me." She pulled up a slide showing the federal grant timeline. Sometimes the most effective resistance is strategic advancement. Instead of fighting against what you don't want, you build toward what you do want. Dylan Cruz, who had served his suspension and returned to school as a changed person, added his perspective. "It's like when we were planning to embarrass Mrs. Rodriguez. We thought we were being smart, but we were actually just being destructive. There's a difference between being clever and being wise." Elena nodded approvingly. Dylan's evolution had been remarkable to witness. The boy who had held a phone to record someone's humiliation now used technology to create educational videos for the program's website. The morning session continued with role-playing exercises, where students practiced de-escalating conflicts, mediating disputes, and standing up for others without resorting to aggression. These weren't theoretical discussions, but practical skills development based on real situations. The students encountered daily. At lunch, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Patricia Wells, the district superintendent, appeared in her classroom. Doorway carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression that suggested both satisfaction and amazement. "Elena, I have news," Dr. Wells said, settling into a student desk. "The State Education Department wants to designate our Veterans Leadership Academy as a model program for their new character education initiative." Elena looked up from the curriculum materials she was reviewing. "What does that designation entail?" "Funding for expansion, training workshops for other districts, and development of a teacher certification program for veterans entering education." Dr. Wells opened the envelope and pulled out official letterhead. "They're also recommending you for the State Teacher Excellence Award." The recognition was gratifying, but Elena found herself more interested in the practical implications. How many districts would be involved in the expansion? Initially, 12 districts across 3 counties. If the pilot succeeds, they want to scale it statewide within 2 years. Dr. Wells leaned forward. "Elena, I need to ask you something honestly. When you stood up at that assembly, did you have any idea this would be the result?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I knew that someone needed to demonstrate that actions have consequences. I knew that students were watching to see whether adults would actually protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. But no, I never imagined it would lead to systematic change." "Well, it has, and not just here." Dr. Wells pulled out her phone and showed Elena a news article. 3 different schools in other states have reported incidents where teachers used your assembly response as a model for handling public bullying situations. Elena read the headline, "Veteran Teachers Anti-Bullying Stand Inspires National Movement." The article described similar incidents where educators had chosen public accountability over private discipline, citing Elena's approach as validation for their decisions. "There's something else," Dr. Wells said. "The Morrison family requested a meeting with me last week." Elena felt her attention sharpen. She hadn't heard from the Morrisons since the district hearing, though she occasionally saw Caleb in the hallways. The boy maintained his distance and had reportedly improved his behavior significantly after completing mandatory counseling. What did they want? They wanted to apologize. Dr. Wells smiled at Elena's surprised expression. "Apparently, Caleb has been working with a therapist who helped him understand the impact of his actions," Mrs. Morrison said. "They now realize that their son needed the consequences you provided, not the protection they tried to give him." Elena absorbed this information thoughtfully. "How is Caleb doing?" "Better from what I hear. His grades have improved, and he's been participating in community service projects." The counselor suggested that experiencing real consequences for his behavior was actually what he needed to start making better choices. The conversation was interrupted by Amanda Foster, who knocked on the doorframe before entering. Mrs. Rodriguez, sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation that might require adult guidance. Elena immediately gave Amanda her full attention. What's happening? Two students from Lincoln High School showed up wanting to join our program. They said they heard about what we're doing and want to start something similar at their school. Amanda paused. But they also said they're dealing with a bullying problem that involves teachers, not just students. This was new territory. Elena's program had focused on peer-to-peer conflicts, but adult-to-student power dynamics presented more complex challenges. Where are they now? Waiting in the main office. I told them I'd ask you if you had time to meet with them. Elena gathered her materials and followed Amanda to the office, where two high school seniors sat with the patient posture of students, accustomed to waiting for adult attention. They introduced themselves as Sarah Kim and Miguel Santos, student council representatives who had researched Elena's program after hearing about it from younger siblings. Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah began, we have a situation at our school where certain teachers make comments about students' appearances, backgrounds, or family situations. It's not technically against any rules, but it's humiliating and harmful. Miguel added, when students complain, administrators say the teachers are just being honest or trying to motivate us to do better. But it feels like bullying, even if it's coming from adults. Elena recognized the complexity immediately. Adult-to-student power imbalances created different dynamics than peer conflicts, requiring more sophisticated intervention strategies. You documented specific incidents? She asked. We started keeping records after hearing about your approach, Sarah replied, pulling out a notebook. We have dates, witnesses, and direct quotes from 3 different teachers over the past month. Elena reviewed their documentation with growing respect for their thoroughness. These students had learned from her example and adapted it to their own situation. What outcome are you hoping for? We want to create a student advocacy program that gives us a formal way to address inappropriate teacher behavior, Miguel explained. Not to get teachers in trouble, but to establish that student dignity matters even in educational relationships. Elena spent the next hour discussing strategies with the 2 students, drawing on her experience with institutional change and conflict resolution. By the end of the conversation, they had outlined a proposal for a student rights initiative that could be piloted at their school. As the day concluded, Elena reflected on the unexpected directions her simple act of self-defense had taken. What began as a refusal to accept humiliation had evolved into a movement that was changing how educational institutions approached power, respect, and accountability. That evening, she sat in her kitchen with her laptop open, working on curriculum materials for the next phase of program expansion. The fishing line from that October assembly remained in her desk drawer, but it had been joined by letters from students, thank you notes from parents, commendation certificates, and grant approval. Documents. The transformation amazed her sometimes. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where courage meant survival and leadership meant keeping people alive under impossible circumstances. Now she was discovering that civilian courage could be just as demanding and even more far-reaching. In its consequences, her phone buzzed with a text from Jake Patterson. Mrs. Rodriguez, just finished my presentation at Roosevelt Middle School. 47 students signed up for their new peer mediation program afterward. Thank you for showing us that making mistakes doesn't mean we can't help others avoid them. Elena smiled and typed back, thank you for showing others that accountability leads to growth, not just punishment. Outside her kitchen window, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. Somewhere across town, students were doing homework, teachers were planning lessons, and parents were having conversations about character and consequences. That might not have happened if 3 boys hadn't tried to humiliate their English teacher. 6 months earlier, the assembly had lasted 2 hours. The movement it generated was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.